Hi everyone, I'm Kelly and today I'm going to be talking you through the basic rules of causation. We're going to be looking at them in a criminal context, but these rules also do apply to tort law as well. The cases are just different in that they are civil cases rather than criminal cases. So causation, in a nutshell, basically asks whether the defendant in a particular case actually caused the death or the injury of the victim in that particular case. So causation is just one aspect of the actus reus, which I think Lauren is going through with you in her video, and it has to be established for nearly all offences. So there's two types of causation. There's factual causation and legal causation. Those are the two types. There must also be no break in what we call the chain of causation. So when you're writing a scenario question in the exam and you're establishing causation, you have to establish factual causation, legal causation, and that there was no break in the chain of causation. I'm going to go through each one of these in turn now. So I'm going to start off with factual causation. Factual causation is really nice and simple. To establish factual causation, we use something called the Butfor test. So the Butfor test asks a question. So it asks, if it wasn't for the defendant's conduct, would the victim have suffered the death or the injury? So if the answer to that question is no, they wouldn't have, then the Butfor test is satisfied and factual causation is satisfied. If the answer is yes, they would have suffered regardless of the defendant's conduct, then the Butfor test and factual causation is not satisfied. So I'm going to go through a few of the key cases in that context just to sort of explain the test a little bit more, make it a bit clearer. So the first case is Crown and White. So in this case, the defendant was a man who wanted to poison and kill his mother. So he gave his mother a drink with poison in it and she drank it. However, before the poison had a chance to take effect in her body, she died of a heart attack. His mother was quite elderly, so she died of an unrelated heart attack. So if we apply the Butfor test in this case, if it wasn't for the defendant giving his mother the poisoned drink, would she have died anyway? And the answer is yes, she would have died anyway, because she would have had the heart attack regardless. And therefore the Butfor test is not satisfied, factual causation is not satisfied, and the defendant, the son in this case, was not the factual cause of his mother's death. The heart attack was the factual cause of her death. So that's an example of a case where the Butfor test was not satisfied and factual causation was not satisfied. So now we look at Paget, where factual causation was satisfied. So in Paget, the defendant was in a shooting match with the police. He was in his flat and they were waiting outside, and he went out onto the balcony with his pregnant girlfriend and held her up in front of him like a human shield. I think he did this thinking that the police wouldn't shoot at him if he did this. He then started shooting at the police and the police shot back at him in self-defense. Consequently, the police shot his pregnant girlfriend and she died, and her baby died. So if we apply the Butfor test here, if it wasn't for the defendant using his girlfriend as a human shield, would she have died? And the answer is no, she wouldn't have. Because if he hadn't used her as a human shield, she would have been back safe and sound in that flat, and the police wouldn't have shot at her and she wouldn't have died. Therefore, Butfor test is satisfied and factual causation is satisfied. So, in the case of White, factual causation was not satisfied, and therefore it doesn't matter if legal was. There's no causation because you have to have both factual and legal causation. But for Paget, we know factual causation was satisfied, so we can now move on to legal causation. So legal causation asks whether the defendant has legally caused the injury or the death of the victim. Now that sounds like a very broad question, and to help us answer that, legal causation is split down into 3 parts: multiple causes, the thin skull rule, and intervening acts, which is also known as novus actus interveniens. So we're going to start off by looking at multiple causes. So legal causation tells us that it doesn't matter if there is more than one cause of the victim's injury or death. As long as the defendant made a contribution towards the victim's injury or death, which was more than minimal, then that is enough. So one of the cases that we look at for this is Kinsey. So in Kinsey, the defendant and the victim were involved in a high-speed car chase, so they were racing cars with each other, and the victim's car spun out of control, spun into oncoming traffic, and he died as a result. Now, it wasn't very clear what had happened just before his car spun out of control. There were some people saying that the defendant had tried to overtake him. He said he hadn't tried to overtake him, and that the victim had simply sort of knocked on the verge and that made him spin out of control. However, the court said none of that matters, because you have made a contribution, which is more than minimal. So by actually engaging in that high-speed car chase to begin with the victim, you have contributed towards his death in a more than minimal way. So it doesn't matter whether he knocked on the verge or it was because you were trying to overtake him. It doesn't matter if both things happened, you still contributed in a more than minimal fashion. Another case which illustrates this quite nicely is Crown and Hughes. So Crown and Hughes, the defendant was a man who was parked in his camper van on the side of a highway. The victim in this case was a driver who was driving on the wrong side of the road under the influence of heroin. The defendant, the man in the camper van, had no insurance and no licence, so he was parked there illegally. The victim, the drunk driver, came down the wrong side of the road and crashed into the man in the camper van head on and died. So to begin with, the defendant, the man in the camper van, was held to cause death by driving while uninsured and without a licence. However, the courts quashed his conviction because it didn't matter that he was parked there. Yeah, it satisfies the Butfor test. If it wasn't for him being parked there, would the victim have crashed into his camper van? No, he wouldn't have. Therefore, factual causation is satisfied. However, the victim in this case probably would have crashed into something else, even if the man in the camper van wasn't there. The victim was still driving on the wrong side of the road under the influence of heroin. It was likely that he was going to crash into something anyway, whether it was the man in the camper van or not. and therefore he did not make a more than minimal contribution towards his death. He probably would have crashed into a lamppost anyway. Right, so next we need to look at the thin skull rule. So this is also referred to as the eggshell skull rule, thin skull rule. Doesn't matter how you refer to it, it means the same thing. So this tells us that the defendant must take the victim as he finds them. And this basically means that if the victim has something unusual about them that makes their injuries more serious, the defendant will be liable for the more serious injury. So a good sort of illustration of this is Crown and Blau. So in this case, the defendant stabbed the victim, who was a Jehovah's Witness. The victim got taken to the hospital and was told, "You need a blood transfusion to survive." Because of the victim's beliefs as a Jehovah's Witness, she refused the blood transfusion and died as a result. So the defendant argued, well, hang on, if she wasn't a Jehovah's Witness, she wouldn't have refused the blood transfusion. She would have had it and she would have survived. So therefore I should not be liable for her death, only the stabbing. However, the thin skull rule tells us that the defendant must take the victim as he finds them, and in this case, the defendant found the victim as a Jehovah's Witness. So the reason that this is called the thin skull rule or the eggshell skull rule is because if I was to hit someone over the head with, I don't know, a rolling pin, for example, and that person, if I just hit a normal person over the head with a rolling pin, they'd probably just get a bruise. If that person that I decided to hit had a very particularly thin skull, or their skull was made out of an eggshell, for example, their skull would crack. I could not then turn around and say, oh, well, hang on, they've got a really thin skull and therefore I should not be liable for breaking it, because I have to take my victim as I find them. In this case, someone with a very thin skull. Finally, we need to look at intervening acts, also known as novus actus interveniens in Latin. So as well as factual and legal causation, there also has to be no break within the chain of causation. So the chain of causation is the idea that there has to be a direct link between the defendant's conduct and the consequence, so either the death or injury of the victim. However, sometimes something happens after the defendant's conduct that breaks that chain of causation, something in between the conduct and the consequence, which means that there's no longer a direct link or a direct chain of causation. So this is also split into three parts. So we've got the act of a third party, which can break the chain of causation. The victim's own act can sometimes break the chain of causation, and a natural but unpredictable event. Those are the three things. So I'm going to start off by looking at the act of a third party. So we specifically look at medical treatment. Medical treatment will break the chain of causation when it is gross medical treatment. So that is when it is so bad that it can be considered criminal. So the first case that we want to consider here is Smith. So in Smith, the victim was stabbed in the lung. He was a soldier and he was stabbed by another soldier. After he'd been stabbed, he was then taken away on a stretcher by medics and they dropped him off the stretcher. They then put him back on the stretcher, carried him a little bit further towards the ambulance and then dropped him again. So they dropped him off the stretcher twice. However, this was not considered to be, believe it or not, gross medical treatment. It was not enough to break the chain of causation. So next we want to look at Cheshire. So in Cheshire, the defendant shot the victim in the stomach. As a result, the victim needed surgery, developed breathing problems, and needed a tracheotomy, which is where they put a tube in your throat as a sort of artificial air passage to help you breathe. So the victim then suffered complications from the tracheotomy, which were common complications. As a result, he died. However, the victim's gunshot wounds actually had almost healed at this point. So the question was, had the chain of causation been broken by these common complications from the tracheotomy? And the answer was no, they hadn't. Common complications is not enough for gross medical treatment. It's a common complication. It could happen to anyone. It wasn't that that doctor had been grossly negligent in any way and done it horrifically wrong. It could have happened to anyone, and it wasn't enough to break the chain of causation. So next I'm going to quickly come to Malcherek. Actually, I'm going to save Jordan till last. And Malcherek, the defendant, had stabbed his wife. She was declared brain dead, and the doctors switched off the life support machine. The question was whether them switching off the life support machine had broken the chain of causation. However, it hadn't, because she was already brain dead. And legally, once the brain stem has died and you are brain dead, you are legally dead. So technically, they hadn't killed her. So Malcherek tells us that doctors turning off the life support machine of a brain dead person will not break the chain of causation. But finally, I'm going to come to Jordan, which is sort of the defining case for what is gross medical treatment. So in the case of Jordan, the victim sustained wounds from the defendant and was in hospital recovering. Those wounds had almost completely healed when one of the doctors came along and gave him a dose of antibiotics to which he was allergic. Now, if that doctor had just gone to the end of his bed, checked his clipboard, checked his notes, he would have seen that he was allergic to those antibiotics. However, he didn't, gave him the antibiotics, he had a severe allergic reaction and he died. Now that was held to be enough to break the chain of causation. That was a sufficiently independent act, his wounds had almost healed, and that was gross medical negligence from the doctor, and therefore the chain of causation had been broken and the original defendant, who had given the victim them wounds in the first place, was not liable for his murder. So next we have the victim's conduct. So the victim's own conduct will only break the chain of causation if it is unreasonable. And there's two cases which are really quite similar, which illustrate this very nicely. So I'm going to come to Crown and Williams first. So in this case, the victim was hitchhiking and was picked up by the defendants. The defendants then attempted to steal his wallet, and because he didn't want his wallet stolen, he jumped out of the moving vehicle and sustained injuries. So the question was, did the defendants who were trying to steal his wallet, were they liable for those injuries that he had sustained? However, it was held that him jumping out of the car to avoid having his wallet stolen was unreasonable. And therefore the chain of causation was broken by his unreasonable act. However, in the case of Roberts, it was a very similar situation, but the victim was a woman who was in a car with the defendant, and the defendant started to make sexual advances towards her. Fearing that she was going to be sexually assaulted or raped, she jumped out of the car and sustained injuries. in this case, it was held that her jumping out of the car was not unreasonable and it would not break the chain of causation, because jumping out of a car to escape sexual assault or rape is completely reasonable. However, jumping out just to avoid having your wallet stolen is not. So in the case of Roberts, the chain of causation was not broken. The defendant was liable for her injuries that she sustained jumping out the car. But in Williams, the defendant was not liable because the chain of causation was broken by the victim's own unreasonable act. So finally, we look at natural but unpredictable events. So this is essentially an act of God which breaks the chain of causation. So for example, a hurricane, a tsunami, an earthquake, something natural but unpredictable. So the case that illustrates this is Hart. So for Hart, the defendant beat up the victim and left her on a beach below the tide mark. So he could see, let's say the tide mark goes up to here, you know, when you can sort of see where the tide comes up to, because all the wall is really dark from there downwards where the water's been, and it's normal above that. So let's say it came up to here, he left her below the tide mark, and he sort of, when the tide came in, she was unconscious and as a result drowned. So the question was the tide coming in a natural but unpredictable event? Well, it wasn't, because you could clearly see where the tide mark was. You could see what was going to happen. You could see it was going to come in up to there and she was going to drown. However, the courts used this to sort of say obiter dicta, like what would be a natural but unpredictable event. So the court said in this case there was no break in the chain of causation. It was obvious what would happen. However, if he had left her on a wall above the tide mark, so the tide mark's up here, if he'd have left it up here thinking that would make her safe, and then suddenly there was a freak wave, a freak tsunami that came and washed her away, then the chain of causation would have been broken by a natural and unpredictable event. However, in the case of Hart, it wasn't unpredictable, it was obvious. So that concludes my video on causation. Remember, you need factual causation, which is the Butfor test, legal causation, have they legally caused the death or the injury, so we look at multiple causes and the thin school rule, and there must also be no break in the chain of causation, which you look at intervening acts for. So either the act of a third party, the victim's own act, or a natural but unpredictable event. I hope this helps, and thank you for watching.